If the little girl had stayed in her seat that night, a powerful man would have died before dessert. No one in the restaurant would have noticed anything strange at first. The music would have continued playing softly. Guests would have laughed over wine and expensive meals. A man would have collapsed quietly at his table, and the story would have ended there. But that didn't happen. Because a 10-year-old girl named Iris, Vale heard something she was never meant to understand. And instead of staying silent, she decided to act. It began as a normal evening. Iris sat across from her mother, Naomi, at a beautifully set table, inside one of the most elegant restaurants she had ever seen. Warm candlelight flickered across polished silverware while soft music floated through the air like a whisper. Everything about the place felt delicate and expensive. Crystal glasses sparkled. Waiters moved gracefully between tables. People dressed in fine clothes spoke in quiet voices as if the room demanded it. Naomi looked both excited and nervous at the same time. The truth was, they didn't usually eat in places like this. Naomi had been working extra hours for weeks just to afford this small celebration. After months of struggling, she had finally gotten a steady job again, and tonight was her way of giving Iris something special. Something hopeful. "I know it's a little fancy," Naomi said with a warm smile while adjusting the napkin in Iris's lap. "But tonight we deserve it." Iris smiled back politely. But her curious eyes were already exploring the room. She loved observing people. It was like reading little stories without words. And one table caught her attention almost immediately. In the far corner of the dining room sat a man in a perfectly tailored dark suit. 2 large bodyguards stood nearby, watching the room carefully. Yet the man himself looked completely relaxed. He wasn't loud like the other wealthy guests. He didn't try to draw attention. He simply sat there calmly, speaking quietly to the woman across from him. The woman had long dark hair and soft eyes. When she laughed, the sound was gentle and sincere. Her name was Elena Romano, though Iris didn't know that yet. The man she was sitting with was Lorenzo DeMarco. To most people in the room, he was just another wealthy guest enjoying dinner. But beyond those walls, his name carried a very different kind of reputation. Still, none of that mattered to Iris. To her, he was simply a quiet man having dinner with someone who clearly cared about him. After a few minutes, Iris leaned closer to her mother. "Can I go to the restroom?" she asked. Naomi nodded. "Of course," she said. "Just don't wander." Iris slid out of her chair and carefully walked toward the hallway, leading to the restrooms. As she moved farther from the dining room, the soft music faded behind her. The hallway was dimmer and much quieter, almost empty. She had just reached the corner when she heard voices. 2 men stood near a service door speaking in low tones. At first Iris barely paid attention, but then something made her stop. They weren't speaking English. They were speaking Italian, and Iris understood every word. Most people didn't know this about her. For years she had secretly been teaching herself the language using old voice recordings left behind by her father before he disappeared from their lives. What began as curiosity slowly became something she grew surprisingly good at. Now that strange skill suddenly felt like a curse, because the conversation she was hearing made her heart begin to pound. "The poison is already mixed in the sauce," one man said quietly. The second man replied without hesitation. "The seafood risotto goes to DeMarco's table." Iris froze. Her fingers tightened slightly against the wall beside her. The first man continued speaking in a calm voice that felt disturbingly casual. "He eats. His heart stops before dessert. Everyone will think it's an allergic reaction." "And our plates?" the second man asked. "Identical," the first answered. "Except ours will be clean." Iris felt the blood drain from her face. These men weren't joking. They were planning a murder. Right here, inside the restaurant. "After tonight," the second man said softly, "Lorenzo DeMarco won't be a problem anymore." The name hit Iris like ice. DeMarco. The man sitting at the corner table. The man having dinner with the woman who kept smiling at him. Iris slowly leaned forward just enough to peek around the wall. One of the men wore a waiter's uniform. The other looked like an ordinary guest. But the cold calmness in their voices made it clear this was not their first time planning something like this. Iris quickly stepped back before they noticed her. Her heart was beating so fast it almost hurt. She could return to her table, pretend she heard nothing. After all, she was just a child. None of this was her responsibility. But then she thought about the quiet man in the corner booth, and the woman smiling across from him. They had no idea what was about to happen. Iris took a deep breath. Then she turned around and walked back toward the dining room. Not toward her mother, but toward Lorenzo DeMarco's table. Because in just a few moments, everything in that restaurant was about to change. By the time Iris stepped back into the dining room, her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. For a moment, she almost turned back. The restaurant suddenly felt much larger than before. The soft music, the warm lights, the quiet laughter from other guests, it all felt strangely distant now, like she was walking through a dream. No one else knew what she had just heard. No one else realized that somewhere in the kitchen, a plate of food was being prepared that could kill a man within minutes. Iris glanced toward her mother. Naomi was still sitting at their table, scrolling through her phone and waiting patiently for their meal. She had no idea that her daughter had just stumbled into something dangerous. Iris knew she could simply return to her seat. She could sit down, eat dinner, and leave. The rest would not be her problem. But when her eyes drifted back to the corner of the room, she saw Lorenzo DeMarco again. He was still sitting there calmly, speaking with the woman across from him. Elena Romano leaned forward slightly as she talked, her expression warm and gentle. She looked completely relaxed, as if nothing in the world could possibly disturb this quiet evening. Iris swallowed. They had no idea. If she said nothing, that man would soon take a bite of poisoned food while the woman across from him watched. And by the time anyone realized something was wrong, it would already be too late. Iris's small hands clenched slightly at her sides. Then she started walking. Each step toward the corner table felt heavier than the last. The floor seemed to stretch endlessly between her and the man she needed to warn. Halfway there, one of Lorenzo's bodyguards noticed her. The tall man frowned slightly as the little girl approached. "Hey, sweetheart," he said gently but firmly. "You can't." Before he could finish, Lorenzo lifted a hand without even turning his head. The guard immediately stopped speaking. Now Lorenzo looked at her. His dark eyes studied the small girl standing beside the table. There was something unusual about the way she had walked up, no hesitation, no childish curiosity, just urgency. "What is it?" he asked calmly. Iris felt every eye at the table on her now. For a second, the words refused to come out. But then she remembered the conversation in the hallway. The poison. The plan. And suddenly the fear mattered less than the truth. She leaned slightly closer and spoke quietly. "Don't eat the risotto." The table fell silent. Even the soft music in the restaurant seemed to fade. Elena blinked in confusion. "I'm sorry," she asked gently. Before Iris could answer, a familiar voice suddenly spoke behind her. "Oh, excuse me," the man said smoothly. Iris turned and felt her stomach twist. One of the men from the hallway had followed her. He approached the table with an easy smile. "I believe the little girl misunderstood something," he said politely. He placed a hand lightly on the back of a nearby chair, pretending to laugh. "We were simply discussing a business shipment in Italian earlier. Children sometimes hear things out of context." The bodyguards immediately became tense. One of them looked ready to remove the man from the table. But Lorenzo didn't move. He didn't even glance at the plate of seafood risotto that had just been placed in front of him. moments earlier. Instead, he continued studying Iris. Children were not usually this serious. They didn't walk up to powerful strangers and interrupt dinner for no reason. And the way the girl was looking at him now, there was no hesitation in her eyes. Only fear and determination. What exactly did you hear? Lorenzo asked quietly. The man beside Iris quickly spoke again. It's nothing, he insisted with another forced smile. The girl clearly misunderstood. Lorenzo raised his hand again. This time the gesture was slower, sharper. The man fell silent immediately. The entire table waited. Iris took a small breath. Then she said the words she had been holding back since the hallway. They said the poison is already mixed in the sauce, she whispered. For the first time, Lorenzo's expression changed. Not panic, not anger, just a very small shift in his eyes. He looked down at the plate in front of him. Then he slowly pushed it away. One of his bodyguards immediately stepped forward. Take it to the kitchen, Lorenzo said calmly. Test it. The man nodded and lifted the plate carefully. Across the table, Elena's face had gone pale. She reached across instinctively and touched Lorenzo's hand. You don't actually think, but she stopped speaking when she noticed something. The man who had followed Iris to the table was no longer smiling. And suddenly, the quiet dinner that had started so peacefully felt like it was, balancing on the edge of something far more dangerous. For the next few minutes, no one at the table spoke. The bodyguard carrying the plate disappeared into the kitchen, while the rest of Lorenzo DeMarco's men quietly moved closer, their attention now fixed on the man who had followed Iris to the table. The restaurant still looked peaceful on the outside. Guests continued eating. Soft music played. Glasses clinked gently. But at the corner booth, the atmosphere had changed completely. Lorenzo sat perfectly still, his hands folded loosely on the table as if nothing unusual had happened. Across from him, Elena Romano watched him with growing concern. Her fingers still rested lightly on his hand, though she didn't seem to notice she was holding it. Lorenzo, she whispered quietly. Do you think she's right? Lorenzo didn't answer immediately. Instead, his eyes shifted toward the man standing near the table. The man tried to keep his posture relaxed, but small details betrayed him. The tightness in his jaw, the way his fingers twitched slightly against the chair. People who had nothing to hide rarely looked like that. Sit down, Lorenzo said calmly. The man blinked. I'm sorry? Lorenzo gestured to the empty chair beside the table. Sit, he repeated. Slowly, the man obeyed. 2 bodyguards stepped closer behind him. The smile he had worn earlier had completely vanished now. I think there has been a misunderstanding, the man said carefully. Lorenzo tilted his head slightly. A child walks up to my table, he said in a quiet voice, interrupts my dinner and warns me about poison. His gaze hardened slightly. That is not a misunderstanding. Elena's grip on his hand tightened a little. For the first time since they had started seeing each other, she was witnessing the side of Lorenzo that people whispered about. The calm, the quiet authority, the dangerous patience. Still, she didn't pull her hand away. That alone did not go unnoticed. Lorenzo glanced at her briefly. There was fear in her eyes. But something else too. Concern. Not for herself. For him. That realization stayed quietly in the back of his mind. Just then, footsteps approached quickly from the kitchen. The bodyguard returned. His face said everything before he even spoke. Lorenzo looked up. Well? The guard leaned closer and spoke in a low voice. There's poison in the sauce, Elena gasped softly. The man sitting beside them suddenly tried to stand. He didn't make it far. One of the bodyguards grabbed his shoulder and forced him back into the chair. The calm atmosphere of the restaurant shattered instantly. 2 more guards appeared from the entrance while another moved toward the kitchen. Guests nearby began noticing the tension. Whispers started spreading from table to table. But Lorenzo remained perfectly composed. He turned his attention slowly toward Iris. The small girl was still standing beside the table, looking slightly overwhelmed by everything that had just happened. Up close, she suddenly looked exactly what she was. A child. A brave one. But still a child. You understood their conversation, Lorenzo said gently. Iris nodded quietly. They were speaking Italian, she said. Elena looked surprised. You speak Italian? Iris hesitated slightly. I've been learning, she admitted. Lorenzo studied her for another moment. Then he leaned back slightly in his chair. If you had not come here, he said calmly, I would already be dead. The weight of that statement hung heavily in the air. Elena looked at Iris with a mixture of shock and admiration. You saved his life, she said softly. Iris shifted awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. I just told the truth, she said. Behind them, Lorenzo's men were already escorting the captured assassin away from the dining room. The second man from the hallway had vanished during the commotion, disappearing somewhere through the kitchen. But Lorenzo didn't seem worried. That problem would be handled later. Right now, his attention remained on the little girl, who had just changed the course of his evening, perhaps even his life. What is your name? He asked. Iris, she replied. And your family? She pointed toward the other side of the restaurant. My mom is over there. Naomi had finally noticed the commotion and was now standing up from her table, looking confused and worried as she searched for her daughter. Lorenzo followed Iris's gaze. He exhaled slowly. The situation had just become far more complicated. Because if someone had just attempted to kill him, the people who interrupted that plan would not be forgotten, which meant Iris and her mother were now in danger, whether they realized it or not. Lorenzo stood up from his chair. Elena looked up at him. What are you going to do? She asked quietly. Lorenzo looked back at Iris. Then he gave a simple answer. The only thing I can do. He gestured for one of his bodyguards to approach. Prepare the car, he said. Then he turned back to the small girl. You saved my life tonight, Iris. His voice softened slightly. And that means I now owe you a debt. Across the room, Naomi hurried toward them in confusion. But Iris had the strange feeling that her life had already changed in ways she didn't yet understand. Because the quiet dinner that was supposed to be a celebration had just pulled her family into a world far more dangerous than she could imagine. Naomi reached the table breathless and confused. Iris, she said quickly, pulling her daughter close. What's going on? Why are you over here? Her eyes moved nervously between the large men standing around the table and the well-dressed stranger in the dark seat. She had no idea what she had just walked into. Iris looked up at her mother, unsure how to explain everything that had happened in just a few minutes. Before she could speak, Lorenzo DeMarco stepped forward. Your daughter did something very important tonight, he said calmly. Naomi instinctively tightened her grip on Iris's shoulders. I'm sorry if she disturbed you, Naomi replied quickly. She didn't mean to interrupt your dinner. Lorenzo shook his head slowly. No, he said. I'm very glad she did. Naomi frowned slightly, not understanding. Elena stepped closer and offered Naomi a reassuring smile. It's all right, she said gently. Your daughter overheard something dangerous and warned Lorenzo before he could eat his food. Naomi blinked. Dangerous, she repeated. For a brief moment, Lorenzo glanced toward one of his guards. The man nodded subtly, confirming that the restaurant was now secured and the captured assassin had been removed. Only then did Lorenzo speak again. The meal that was served to me contained poison, he explained. Naomi stared at him in disbelief. That's not possible, she whispered. It is, Lorenzo replied calmly. And if your daughter had remained silent, it would have killed me. Naomi slowly looked down at Iris. You You knew? She asked softly. Iris nodded. I heard two men talking in the hallway, she said quietly. They were planning it. Naomi's face went pale. She pulled Iris closer, wrapping her arms around her protectively. My God, she whispered. The situation suddenly felt very real. Too real. Naomi looked at Lorenzo again, worry now filling her eyes. What happens now? She asked. Lorenzo did not hesitate. Now we leave. Naomi frowned. Leave? Lorenzo's expression remained calm, but his voice carried quiet seriousness. The men who planned this will realize very quickly that their attempt failed, he said. And when they discover how it failed, he looked down at Iris, they will want to know who stopped them. A chill ran through Naomi's spine. You're saying they'll come after us? She asked. Lorenzo gave a small nod. They might. Naomi's first instinct was denial. This kind of danger belonged in movies, not in real life. But the bodyguards surrounding the table, the tension still lingering in the air, and the quiet confidence in Lorenzo's voice made it impossible to ignore. Elena stepped closer to Naomi. Lorenzo isn't trying to frighten you, she said softly. He's trying to protect you. Naomi looked down at Iris again. Her daughter had done something brave. But bravery sometimes brought consequences. What do we do? Naomi asked quietly. Lorenzo gestured toward one of his men standing nearby. My driver is preparing a secure vehicle outside, he said. He will take you home safely tonight. Naomi hesitated. You don't have to do that, she said. Yes, Lorenzo replied firmly. I do. He looked directly at Iris again. A life was saved tonight, he said. That creates a responsibility. Elena noticed the way Lorenzo spoke. For someone known to be ruthless, there was genuine gratitude in his voice. And something else too. Respect. Not many people earn that from him. Marco will stay nearby for a few days, Lorenzo continued, nodding toward the tall bodyguard waiting near the door. Just until we are certain the situation is resolved. Naomi opened her mouth to protest again, but Iris gently tugged her sleeve. It's okay, Mom, she whispered. Naomi sighed softly. The entire evening had turned upside down so quickly that arguing no longer seemed useful. All right, she said quietly. Lorenzo gave a short nod. Marco approached immediately. The car is ready, he said. As they began walking toward the exit, Elena suddenly knelt down beside Iris. Up close, her gentle smile looked even warmer. You were very brave tonight, Elena said softly. Iris looked a little shy. I just didn't want him to die, she replied. Elena glanced briefly toward Lorenzo. A faint smile appeared on her face. Neither did I, she admitted. Then she removed a small silver charm from her bracelet. It was shaped like a tiny violin. She placed it carefully in Iris's hand. For courage, Elena said. Iris stared at the charm, surprised. Thank you, she whispered. Across the room, Lorenzo watched the moment quietly. Something about the scene stayed with him. A brave child, a worried mother, and Elena, whose kindness seemed to soften every room she entered. For the first time that night, Lorenzo allowed himself to breathe a little easier. But deep down, he knew the danger was not over yet. Because somewhere out there, the man who planned the assassination was already learning that his plan had failed. And men like that rarely accepted failure quietly. As Iris and her mother stepped into the waiting car, neither of them realized the truth. The quiet dinner they had come to celebrate had only been the beginning. The real storm was still coming. The ride home felt unreal. Iris sat quietly in the back seat beside her mother while the large, black car moved smoothly through the dark streets. The windows were tinted, the doors heavy, and the calm driver in the front seat Marco rarely spoke. Everything about the vehicle felt different from the world Iris was used to. Safer, but also stranger. Naomi still looked shaken. Every few minutes she glanced at Iris as if making sure her daughter was truly sitting beside her. "You should have told me," Naomi said softly after a long silence. "I know," Iris replied quietly. "I was scared." Naomi sighed and gently brushed a strand of hair from Iris's face. "You did something very brave tonight." Iris looked down at the small silver violin charm Elena had given her. It rested in her palm, catching the faint glow of the streetlights outside. "I didn't think about being brave," Iris admitted. "I just didn't want that man to die." Naomi squeezed her daughter's hand. "Most adults would have stayed quiet," she said. Marco glanced at them briefly through the mirror. "That's true," he said calmly. Neither of them noticed the respect in his voice. When they finally arrived home, Marco stepped out first and quietly checked the area before opening the door for them. "I'll remain nearby," he explained. "Just in case." Naomi hesitated at the doorway. "You really think someone might come after us?" Marco didn't answer immediately. Instead, he chose his words carefully. "The men who planned tonight's attack are professionals," he said. "And professionals don't like mistakes." That answer was enough. Naomi nodded slowly and guided Iris inside. The apartment suddenly felt smaller than usual. The familiar walls, the small living room, the quiet kitchen, it was all the same. Yet everything felt different now. Danger had followed them home. Iris walked into her bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. Her mind kept replaying the night's events. The whispered conversation in the hallway. The fear in the assassin's eyes. The moment Lorenzo pushed the plate away. For a long time she simply stared at the violin charm in her hand. Then something else came to her mind. Her father, Leon. He had disappeared years ago, leaving behind only a few belongings and a collection of old voice messages he had once sent to her. Most people believed he had simply walked away. But Iris had never been sure. Slowly, she opened the small wooden box on her desk. Inside were several old recordings and printed messages her father had left long ago. Many of them were written in Italian. For years, she had practiced translating them like little puzzles. But tonight felt different. Now the language wasn't just a hobby. It had saved someone's life. And suddenly Iris felt a strange pull to read the messages again. She picked one at random and began translating quietly. At first, the sentences seemed ordinary. Small greetings, little jokes, encouraging words from a father to his daughter. But then she noticed something unusual. A sentence that didn't quite make sense. "The phoenix will rise when the melody finds its key." Iris frowned slightly. She remembered reading that line before, but tonight it stood out more clearly. She reached for another message. This one mentioned something similar. Truth sometimes hides where music once lived. Iris leaned forward, thinking, why would her father hide strange phrases inside simple messages? Unless they weren't just messages. They were clues. Iris quickly grabbed a notebook and began writing down the unusual lines she had found. Phoenix, melody, key, music. The more she looked, the more she noticed patterns. It was like her father had hidden a secret inside ordinary conversations. But why? In the living room, Naomi was quietly speaking with Marco near the door. "Do you think this will really be over soon?" she asked. Marco remained calm. "I hope so," he replied. That deep down, he knew something Naomi didn't. The man behind the assassination attempt, Riccardo Vanni, was not someone who simply disappeared after failure. If anything, he would be more dangerous now. Meanwhile, in her room, Iris stared at the notebook filled with strange phrases. One line suddenly stood out above the others. "The melody leads to truth where the phoenix sleeps." Iris slowly whispered the words again. Then something clicked. Music, melody, the violin charm. Her father had loved music, and suddenly a strange feeling settled in her chest. These weren't random phrases. Her father had been trying to tell her something. Something important. Something hidden. But before Iris could think further, a loud sound suddenly echoed outside the apartment building. A car door slammed. Voices moved quickly through the night. And somewhere in the darkness, someone had just arrived who was very interested in the little girl who had ruined a very expensive assassination. The noise outside the apartment building came suddenly. Iris looked up from her notebook while Naomi turned toward the window in the living room. A car door slammed. Then another. Marco immediately stepped closer to the entrance and quietly placed his hand inside his jacket where a concealed weapon rested. "Stay back," he said calmly. Naomi's heart began to race again. "What's happening?" she whispered. Marco moved toward the window and carefully shifted the curtain, just enough to see outside. A black sedan had pulled up near the building. 2 men stepped out. They looked around briefly before walking toward the entrance. Marco's expression hardened. "They found us faster than I expected," he said quietly. Naomi felt fear rush through her chest. "You said we would be safe." "You are," Marco replied firmly. "That's why I'm here." Before Naomi could respond, a loud knock echoed through the apartment door. 3 slow, heavy knocks. Iris stepped out of her room, her notebook still clutched in her hand. "Mom?" Naomi quickly pulled her close. Marco approached the door slowly. "Who is it?" he called. For a moment, there was silence. Then a calm voice answered from the hallway. "Delivery." Marco almost smiled at the lie. "We didn't order anything," he replied. Another pause. Then the handle of the door suddenly jerked as someone tried to force it open. Marco moved instantly. "Get back," he ordered. Naomi grabbed Iris and hurried toward the bedroom. The door burst open seconds later. 2 men rushed inside. Marco was already moving. The first man barely had time to raise his arm before Marco knocked the weapon from his hand and slammed him against the wall. The second attacker lunged forward, but Marco was faster. Within seconds, both men were on the ground, disarmed and unable to move. Naomi stared in shock. Iris peeked from behind her mother, her heart pounding. Marco quickly tied the men's wrists with zip restraints he carried in his jacket. Then he pulled out his phone. "We have visitors," he said calmly. On the other end of the call, Lorenzo DeMarco listened in silence. "Anyone hurt?" Lorenzo asked. "No," Marco replied. But this confirms it. Lorenzo already knew what he meant. Riccardo Vanni had reacted. And he had reacted quickly. "I'm coming," Lorenzo said. "Bring Elena?" Marco asked. There was a brief pause. "No," Lorenzo answered. "This isn't a place for her tonight." Meanwhile, inside the apartment, Iris slowly stepped closer to the captured men. They looked angry, frustrated, but also frightened. "You work for the man who wanted to poison him," Iris said quietly. One of the men glared at her. "You should have stayed quiet, little girl." Naomi pulled Iris back immediately. "Don't talk to them," she said firmly. Within 20 minutes, another car arrived outside. Marco opened the door when he heard the footsteps in the hallway. Lorenzo entered the apartment calmly. The room suddenly felt smaller with his presence inside it. His sharp eyes quickly studied everything. The broken door, the restrained attackers, the frightened mother, and the small girl standing beside her. "You see?" One of the captured men sneered. "The boss won't stop." Lorenzo crouched slightly in front of him. "Your boss already failed tonight," he said quietly. The man laughed bitterly. "You don't understand." Lorenzo tilted his head slightly. "Then explain it to me." The man looked toward Iris. "That girl ruined something much bigger than dinner." The room fell silent. Lorenzo's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" The man smirked. "You think tonight was about killing you?" He shook his head slowly. "No." Then his voice lowered. "It was about sending a message." Naomi felt a chill run down her spine. What message? She asked. The man's eyes shifted back to Lorenzo. That Riccardo Vanni owns this city now. Lorenzo stood slowly. For a moment he said nothing. Then he turned toward Marco. Take them, he said. Marco nodded and pulled the attackers to their feet. As they were dragged toward the door, one of them laughed again. You saved your life tonight, he told Lorenzo. Then he looked directly at Iris, but the girl just started a war. The door closed behind them. Silence returned to the apartment. Naomi sat down slowly, overwhelmed. Iris looked up at Lorenzo. Did I make things worse? She asked quietly. Lorenzo looked at her for a long moment. Then he shook his head. No, his voice was calm but certain. You told the truth. He glanced briefly toward the dark window outside. And men like Riccardo Vanni don't scare me. But deep down, Lorenzo understood something important. The assassination attempt had never been just about revenge. It had been a test, a signal, and somewhere out there, the man behind it was already planning his next move. The only question now was, how far he was willing to go to finish what he started.